The summer air was thick with warmth when I arrived at my uncle's house, a quiet sanctuary nestled at the very end of a peaceful street. There was something timeless about his home, as if the walls had absorbed years of laughter and whispered secrets, carrying them in the stillness. As I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaked softly beneath my feet, and the scent of jasmine lingered in the air, mingling with a faint aroma of coffee drifting from inside. The door swung open before I had the chance to knock. My uncle stood there, his face breaking into a wide, familiar smile, his presence as steady as I remembered. "You've grown so much," he said, ruffling my hair like he had when I was a child. I laughed, a sound that felt both natural and foreign, caught somewhere between nostalgia and comfort. There was something grounding about being here, something that made me feel safe in a way I hadn't in a long time. The first few days passed quietly. I spent my mornings curled up by the window with a book while he worked in his small study, the sound of his pen scratching against paper filling the silence. Evenings were different, more alive, threaded with stories. We sat on the porch as the sun melted into hues of gold and rose, his voice calm yet compelling as he recounted his travels abroad. I found myself drawn in, captivated by the way he spoke, not just by his words but by the weight they carried. He was thoughtful, deliberate, kind. Then, one evening, as the sky deepened into a dusky pink, I found myself laughing harder than I had in months. He had just finished telling some ridiculous story about getting lost in Italy, complete with exaggerated gestures and a self-deprecating smirk. My sides ached from laughter, and for the first time in a long while, I felt light. His expression softened as he looked at me. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice quieter now. A strange warmth spread through my chest, but beneath it was something else, something unfamiliar. I pushed the thought aside, unwilling to examine it too closely. But over time I started noticing things. The way he brewed my coffee exactly how I liked it, without me ever having to ask. The way he draped a blanket over my shoulders if I dozed off on the couch. The way his gaze lingered just a second too long when our eyes met. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen struggling with a stubborn jar of pasta sauce when he stepped behind me, reaching over to help. His hand brushed against mine, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. My breath hitched. "Got it," he said with a triumphant grin, but I barely heard him. My thoughts raced, my pulse quickened, and I scolded myself for feeling this way. He was family. This wasn't supposed to happen. That night, sleep refused to come. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every lingering glance, every quiet gesture. I reminded myself of how safe I felt around him, how natural it was to be close. But my heart whispered something else, something I wasn't ready to name. The next evening we sat outside again. The air smelled faintly of rain, and he handed me a cup of tea, the steam curling lazily between us. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. I wanted to tell him everything, the feelings I couldn't explain, the way my heart seemed to pull toward him despite the logic screaming at me to stop. But instead I just smiled and took a sip of tea, pretending nothing had changed. Except everything had. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the window as I sat at the dining table, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly. My mind circled back to the way his hand had brushed against mine, how it had felt like more than just an accident. He walked into the room, casually dressed in a fitted shirt and jeans, his sleeves rolled up. I noticed the way his forearms flexed as he moved, the effortless strength in his posture. "You're quiet today," he said, pulling out the chair beside me. "Just thinking," I mumbled, forcing a smile. But the truth was, I couldn't stop noticing him. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way his eyes seemed to search mine, holding just a second too long. Was I imagining it? Was I just confusing comfort with something more? Later that afternoon, I offered to help him cook. He laughed, pretending to be serious about his kitchen skills, but there was an ease between us, passing utensils, bumping shoulders in the small space. At one point, we reached for the same cutting board, and our fingers touched. Neither of us moved. "Sorry," I said quickly, stepping back. He smiled, but there was something different in his eyes. Something thoughtful, something unspoken. That night, as a storm rattled the windows, we curled up on the couch, the glow of the TV flickering against the walls. Without a word, he shifted closer, draping an arm over my shoulders. His warmth seeped through me, my heart pounding against my ribs. I told myself it was just comfort, just an innocent gesture on a stormy night. But the way his fingers traced slow circles on my arm told me otherwise. The next day I tried to put distance between us. I stayed upstairs, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, but when he called me for lunch, I couldn't ignore him. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly as we sat across from each other. I hesitated. But the words wouldn't come. "You don't have to explain," he murmured, his gaze searching mine. "I get it." But he didn't. Because what I felt scared me more than I could admit. That night the power went out. We sat in candlelight, the house unnervingly quiet. The glow cast shadows across his face, making him look different somehow. Softer, more vulnerable. "You've grown up," he said suddenly, his voice low. I swallowed hard. "I guess." His gaze lingered. "You've been on my mind," he admitted. "And I know I shouldn't feel this way, but—" He stopped himself, shaking his head like he regretted even starting. My heart raced. I should have said something. I should have ended it before it became something we couldn't take back. But I didn't. 'Cause I knew. Felt it too. The morning of my departure arrived too soon. As I packed, my emotions twisted into a tangled mess of longing and restraint. Before I left, I sat at the kitchen table and scribbled a note. "I don't know what this feeling means, but I know it's real. And I know you feel it too. I'm leaving because it's the right thing to do. But I'll always carry these memories with me." I placed the note on the counter and walked away, my heart heavy with everything left unsaid. I had barely made it 2 blocks when my phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. "I read your note," he said, his voice strained. "And I need you to know, you're not alone in this." I closed my eyes, my breath catching. "But I care about you too much to let this become something we regret." His words stung. But he was right. "I understand," I whispered. There was a long pause. "You're special to me," he said softly. "That doesn't have to change just because you're leaving." Tears welled in my eyes. But this time they weren't from sadness. "Take care of yourself," I murmured. "You too," he replied. "And if you ever need me, I'm here." The call ended. I stood there for a long moment, letting his words settle. This wasn't the ending I had imagined. No dramatic confession. No perfect resolution. Just 2 people finding the courage to walk away from something they couldn't define. And maybe, in its own way, that was enough.